Good morning. Welcome to Daily Focus. And I missed you yesterday. I wasn't able to get in a daily focus before all of my responsibilities yesterday, but I wanted to deal with 1 Corinthians chapter 7, a passage of scripture that has really been a difficult one to interpret, and some just guess at it, some just ignore it, and some have manipulated it in order to use it for what they really want to do anyway. So the question is does a Christian have the right to divorce an unbelieving spouse? And then the second question would be, then if they do have the right to divorce, do they have the right to remarry? And I think they're asking all the wrong questions. And I think Paul is going to address it from a completely different perspective. And it's always the perspective of the heart of God. And that is, how do we win people to Christ? How is it that we live life with an eternal perspective? Uh, when does it become my number one goal and desire to see someone come to Christ? And what part can I play in that? And I think that's the question that Paul is reminding us to ask as we look at the text here. And so he says in 1 Corinthians 7, in verse number 12, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any man hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away or divorce her. And the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let them depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or else, how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all churches. Well, one of the confusing verses in this is verse number 14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. It is not saying that a person can get saved, or a person can go to heaven because they're married to a Christian, or that children are going to be able to go to heaven because they're parented by a Christian parent. And that's just not the case at all. In fact, verse 16 even elaborates further and says, how do you know whether or not your spouse is even going to get saved? And so it's obviously not stating that staying with an unbelieving spouse is going to help, is going to get them to heaven. But what it is saying is that you lose the influence and the opportunity to be a gospel witness when you are no longer together. And so God's desire is that you be able to stay together, though he understands that there is tension. You are going two different directions. The unbeliever is still under bondage, and the believer has been set free to serve Christ. And these are two different directions. The flesh and the spirit, these are contrary. And so one is in bondage to his flesh, the other has been set free by the Spirit of God. And so there's a natural tension. But if your unbelieving spouse is willing to stay, then this is best. This is a great thing. But if they're going to depart, you're not going to be able to stop them. That's what the text is saying. So what do we do with these questions? Let me just briefly state that Paul is not saying here by any stretch. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, he's going to make it very clear that Christians are not to be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. So he is not advocating for Christians to marry unbelievers at all. Even if they're going to be pleased or they promise to stay with you, that's not the point. The passage here is really, you have two unsaved people, one of them gets saved. And so they're already married, one of them gets saved, and now you have a marriage that has natural tensions because of ideology and direction and belief. And so when you have that dynamic where one of the spouses has just trusted Christ, the other has not yet, what do you do? And Paul is saying, listen, live at peace if you can, because the goal is to win them to Christ. The goal is to see them in heaven for all of eternity. And you have a wonderful place to be able to show them Christ, to be able to live before them a life that pleases Jesus Christ, so that they understand the love of God. They understand the gift of God. They understand the grace and mercy of God because they see it in your life. And so, what Paul is stating here is that if you can be together, that's great. Because in this marriage, as God blesses the saved spouse, the unsaved spouse is benefited. Just like as God blesses the saved parent, the children are benefited. They are able to see uh, the horrors of what is wrong and the consequences that come, and they're able to embrace the blessing of living righteous, obedient, holy lives. And so it is not that they sometimes have a change of destiny, but they do have uh, a change of understanding. They have the opportunity to be able to see the distinction and to be able to see the testimony of the believing parent or the believing spouse. And so that's what it's saying. Now, if the unbeliever depart, you are not under bondage. And that word bondage does not release you from the covenant relationship. But that Greek word, doulou, I think is the Greek word, it really releases you from the responsibility. In other words, the husband or the wife are no longer responsible to perform the responsibilities of the spouse. In other words, the providing and the relationship, marital relationship, the coexistence, those types of things. You can't stop it. And the unbeliever is obviously going another direction. And if they can stay, that's the best thing. And you make that work for peace sake, but for eternity's sake. But if they're going, you're not under bondage. But I'm not really convinced that it gives liberty for remarriage, because God's design has always been reconciliation. And so the desire would be that this person would get saved and come back and reconcile, because we serve a God of reconciliation. And so once you divorce and remarry, reconciliation is not possible any longer. Deuteronomy 24 makes that clear. So it's just a difficult passage, one that's sometimes hard to wrestle through. But I think if we can let God's perspective be our perspective, and we can embrace that God desires that all men come to Christ, that they be saved and have an eternity in heaven with God. And we ought to conduct ourselves, we ought to allow the circumstances of life to always be that which allows me to present Christ, to influence people for Christ. And the best way to do that is by maintaining the relationships. And it's a sad thing when an unbeliever departs, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a friendship, whatever it is. It's a difficult thing because your influence and your ability to reach them for Christ becomes limited. And so it's always best to maintain those relationships, because our desire ought to be first and foremost, before any of our personal desires are met or our personal agendas are fulfilled, that we be in a position to influence people for Jesus Christ and the gospel's sake. May God bless you. I hope we'll share the gospel with somebody today. I'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.